193 citizens were killed in Syria today, mostly in Aleppo, after a massacre that took place in the city of Azaz. Heavy clashes occurred in the capital Damascus after an explosion that targeted the Chief of Staff Center. And a new report accused the Syrian regime of committing war crimes, and Lavrov calls the Western countries to oblige by Geneva's conference outcomes. Welcome to Orient TV English News Bulletin. The local coordination committees said that 193 people were killed in Syria until this moment, 90 of them in Aleppo, where clashes continued between the regime forces and the Free Syrian Army. Meanwhile, the regime-killing machine continued its violent shelling on the neighborhoods of the city. And according to the Free Syrian Army, the regime forces, after 22 days of fighting, could not recover an inch of the liberated city.
This destruction is not caused by an earthquake, but rather by missiles from the regime forces' military aviation that destroyed houses over the heads of their inhabitants. In the city of Azaz, in the suburbs of Aleppo, where the regime-killing machine pounded the city and left its houses flattened on the ground. Al-Assad regime forces also threatened the residents of Andan to bomb the rest of the city in an attempt to move the Battle of Aleppo to the countryside after losing control of more than 70% of the city of Aleppo. The same scene repeats in Mayer, where columns of smoke were seen from several kilometers away from the town as a result of the rocket shelling that destroyed its houses and mosques. And in the city of Aleppo, clashes continued in the neighborhoods of Salah ad-Din and As-Sukkari, as warplanes continue bombing these neighborhoods and other neighborhoods as well, in an attempt to compensate for the losses on the ground. Military helicopters also hovered over Al-Haluniya, Al-Haydariya, Masakin Hanano, and Tariq al-Bab since the early morning hours, and also shelling targeted As-Sakhur neighborhood and Bustan al-Basha, which became recently under the control of the Free Syrian Army. The roads leading to Salah ad-Din Jabari Yard, Al-Aziziyya, and Al-Mishiyya are cut off after a bomb explosion in the region. Meanwhile, the power supply is disconnected in several neighborhoods of Aleppo, including Al-Kallasa and Bustan al-Qasr, while the number of dead and wounded victims is increasing. Also, several people are leaving their houses, as the pain and the suffering became a common denominator for the Syrian people.
Moreover, artillery bombardment from Minna military airport shook Tel Rifat violently, which led to the demolition of several houses and shops. Meanwhile, the city of Manbij witnessed violent clashes between the regime's army and the Free Syrian Army in the early morning hours. In the meantime, bombardment renewed this morning on the neighborhoods of Sab'a Bahrat, Salah ad-Din, Saif al-Dawla, Sha'ar, which led to the fall of several victims and amid violent clashes between the regime's army and the Free Syrian Army.
نحن قيادة لواء التوحيد في حلب وريفها نعلن أن ما صدر من ممارسات وأفعال شنيعة.
In the meantime, the Tawhid Brigade said or condemned the killings of prisoners without trial in Aleppo and accused the regime of trying to distort the image of the Free Army, stressing their commitment to international laws and agreements and inviting the international media to visit the FSA prisons and see firsthand the trials of the prisoners and Shabiha and how they are being treated in those prisons. In Idlib, at least 19 victims fell today by artillery shelling that targeted Jericho and Saraqib in Idlib suburbs. According to the activists, at least 9 victims from the Free Syrian Army died during violent clashes with the regime army in the town of Killi. To that, the pace of artillery shelling increased on the civilian houses in the town of Al-Habit. Meanwhile, the General Authority of the Syrian Revolution documented the fall of 120 victims yesterday, mostly in Idlib and Damascus and its suburbs.
The sound of bullets is still lingering in Idlib skies. Here in the village of Hazano, the helicopter bombing of the regime's military planes doesn't stop. This policy increases the death toll as the forces watch displaced citizens passing through the border lines, especially in the displacement of citizens that occurs in the northern provinces in the area of Bab al-Hawa on the borders with Turkey. The towns of Saraqib, Sarja and Al-Rami were targeted by the heavy artillery bombardment and mortar shells, which led to killing 2 women and increased the death toll today in Saraqib to at least 5 victims, which included 2 women and a child. Meanwhile, Ma'arrat Asreen, Al-Habib and Nasiba were also targeted by the destructive airstrikes at a time where the military campaigns and arbitrary arrests continue to be carried out randomly by the regime in various provinces and Idlib suburbs that were supported by heavy tanks. At the same time, the operations of the Free Syrian Army against the regime don't stop, where it was able to destroy a trail of tanks and armored vehicles in the town of Sarmada. While the regime was heading towards the port of Bab al-Hawa, this event occurred after heavy clashes between both sides took place. In addition to that, members of the Free Syrian Army bombed the tank in Kafar Dakharim, where the Free Army, and with its modest weaponry, is able to defend itself and citizens against the heavily reinforced regime army.
Staying in Idlib, where the Free Syrian Army was able to liberate the old Bab al-Hawa square today near the town of Sarmada in the Idlib suburbs, as they forced the Syrian government army to retreat from the square as a result of their military strikes.
وإعطاء الكثير من آلياته. الله أكبر. الله أكبر ولله الحمد.
And with the acute shortage of fuel in the rebellious areas, the brigade of Asifat al-Shamal has imported Turkish gas in order to secure the needs of the civilians, in a step that is considered the first of its kind since the beginning of the revolution, while the Free Syrian Army will handle the distribution of the fuel among the residents. Moving on to the capital, where violent explosions shook the city of Damascus near the staff headquarters behind Le Méridien Hotel, where international observers reside. In addition to that, fierce clashes took place behind the Iranian embassy in Al-Mazeh, in the vicinity of the Council Ministers building in Kafr Souseh. And in another development, many civilians were wounded due to the bombing of Al-Qadam and Asali neighborhoods, as they were subjected to shelling from tanks stationed on the old highway. Meanwhile, in the capital's suburbs, the regime forces committed another massacre in Douma that claimed the lives of at least 6 people as explosions rocked Ain Tarma, Masraba and Al-Tal. The local coordination committees reported the death of 193 victims in Syria today, mostly in Idlib, while violent explosions rocked the Damascus close to several military buildings behind the Dama Rose Hotel that is hosting and housing United Nations observers.
The capital, Damascus, woke up today's morning on a huge explosion near the General Staff Building, which is a military building that is a few hundred meters away from Al-Umayyad Square in the heart of Damascus. The regime state media announced that the explosion was a result of an explosive device affixed to a fuel tank near the garage of the General Staff and behind the Dama Rose Hotel, where the international observers reside. The Free Syrian Army announced its responsibility for the bombing and said that it had targeted the General Staff Building using 8 explosive devices, adding that the operation resulted in the injury of several officials. From their side, the General Authority of the Syrian Revolution reported that the regime forces imposed a severe security cordon around the site of the blast, and several ambulances entered the site as clouds of black smoke escalated over the area. Meanwhile, activists reported that clashes took place after the bombing between the regime's army and the Free Syrian Army in various neighborhoods in the capital. This comes with the continuation of military operations launched by the regime forces on various districts of Damascus, including Al-Asali and Al-Qadam, where clouds of smoke escalated as a result of the shelling. Also, the regime forces carried out incursions and campaigns of raids and arrests on the neighborhoods of Al-Qabun, Nahr Aisha and Al-Shaghur. Al-Assad regime forces also continue to set out military barriers in most of the capital's neighborhoods, such as Tashrin, Al-Qabun, Al-Shaghur, Al-Marji, and Rukn al-Din. Also, Damascus countryside is not better with the bombing, siege, and raids on the cities and towns of Qadsiya, Saqba, Jisrin, At-Tal, and Qatana, which led to the fall of several victims dead and wounded, and several houses were destroyed as well. And the freedom rally continues, and the Syrians refuse to give up what they had started.
In the countryside of Damascus, artillery bombardment continued on Harasta, Western Ghouta, and Daraya, Tel, Ma'damiyat al-Sham, Qadsiya. And activists reported hearing sounds of massive explosions in those areas. Meanwhile, artillery fire shook the eastern neighborhoods in the city of Al-Damir amid heavy gunfire from the security barriers. To that, huge military reinforcements arrived to Harasta Highway, which coincided with a raid that targeted several houses amid arbitrary arrests. And to know more about the situation in Damascus, we have with us on the line now Tariq Saleh, spokesperson of the Revolution Leadership Council in Damascus. Tariq, good evening to you.
Good evening.
Tariq, what are the latest developments in the capital at the moment?
Right now, the situation is more quiet. But so far, we have 41 victims in Damascus and its suburbs, including 6 civilians, summarily executed in Duma, 6 in Qabun, and another 11 civilians also executed in Masjid after the fight that took place there. Not much events have happened since the last hour. It could be a careful calmness now in the city. But of course, as you mentioned in the report, checkpoints and barriers are spread over the city in different areas. And even in those areas, the calm areas, especially in Muhajirin and Jisr al-Abyad, those areas surrounding the area where the bombing earlier today took place.
Any news about the explosion that happened next to the hotel where the UN observers are residing? Are there any news of any casualties among them?
Unfortunately, no confirmed information came out yet, but I suppose you have seen the declaration made by the Ahbab al-Mustafa and Ahbab al-Rasul, those who are fighting in Damascus, declaring responsibility for the bombing. The initial number says that there are about 20 casualties according to them. According to the state TV, they said that there are only 3 wounded people. They were hospitalized and nothing more. That's all we have.
Tariq Saleh, spokesperson of the Revolution Leadership Council in Damascus, thank you so much for your input. Coming up later in the bulletin, Leon Panetta accuses Iran of forming a militia to fight against the armed opposition. Welcome back. You're watching Orient TV English News Bulletin. In Dar'a, at least 9 victims fell until this moment due to the continued shelling for 4 days on the devastated city of Tafas that led to the death of at least 30 victims so far. Meanwhile, cities of Nahte, Al-Hara, Ankhil, Al-Yadude, Al-Msefra, and Busra al-Sham, villages of Al-Lajat and Al-Hirak witnessed heavy artillery shelling and campaigns of raids and random incursions in civilian houses in search of dissident soldiers amid arbitrary arrests of dozens of citizens in the spread of heavy security in the main streets and alleys.
الكرك الشرقي احتراق أحد المنازل أثر القصف العنيف من
The regime forces intensified their artillery and helicopter shelling at various neighborhoods and towns in the province of Dir'a, especially after the withdrawal of members of the Free Syrian Army from the city of Tafas due to the run out of their ammunition while they were facing the military operations carried out by the regime's army against unarmed civilians. And the area is almost devoid today from its residents as a result of the destruction and devastation caused by the regime forces. The citizens of the devastated city of Al-Hirak also suffer from the barbaric actions of the regime forces. And it is the same situation that the residents of Al-Lajat are facing under the heavy shelling by rocket launchers on most of the villages in Dir'a suburbs that is currently targeting the village of Al-Msika, according to the testimony of local residents. Also, Al-Assad regime forces are still shelling the town of Al-Nasib in Dir'a.
The Networking and Strategic Research Center has said that 25,192 people were killed in Syria since the beginning of the revolution until yesterday. And according to the statistics, the number of children killed has reached 1,972 and about 1,908 women, in addition to 2,155 military personnel. 929 were tortured to death. And the number of the civilians who are still missing has reached more than 65,000, and more than 216,000 are still detained. And moving on to Homs, where at least 9 were murdered today, most of them in Al-Rastan. More than 40 wounded victims died in the bombing which targeted the city. The shelling also hit the city of Talbisa, especially on the west side, which was targeted by more than 15 shells. And the old Homs neighborhoods were also targeted by rockets, mortars and heavy artillery, as many houses were set ablaze. And on the other hand, the Free Syrian Army managed to destroy one of the regime tanks in Al-Khalidiyya neighborhood.
المتفجرة على يد الجيش الحر.
الله أكبر الله أكبر كتاب فاروق في مدينة تلبيسة معركة التحرير.
Regardless of the battles that are occurring to free Damascus and Aleppo, the Syrian rebels, and for the third consecutive day, carry out the mission to free Homs and its suburbs. Here in the city of Talbise, the rebels used heavy machine guns and various weaponry to free the security barriers positioned on the edges of the city. This is a tactic that comes as a warm-up to get into the city of Homs and free it.
Allahu Akbar.
The battles occurred on the edges of the cities and towns of Homs, where the regime forces have positioned security barriers and military camps, where it bombs residential buildings and areas from a long distance. Meanwhile, the Free Syrian Army captured members of the Syrian regime during these battles. In Al-Rastan and Al-Qusayr, the regime forces intensified its rocket and military plane bombardment, which led to causing many injuries and killing civilians, as well as destroying many towns. The bombing reached the towns of Al-Buwaida, Dar Ma'la, and Ghanto, that were bombed by the regime's heavy rocket launchers.
هذه القذائف التي يمطر بها بشار الأسد الشعب السوري الآمن.
The city of Homs, and specifically the old neighborhoods, are still under the suffocating besiegement that lasted for over 70 days, amid the disconnection of food and medical supplies, whereas the mortar shells are still hitting many neighborhoods daily. The mosque of Al-Annaba was targeted in the city of Old Homs, which serves as a witness to the amount of tragedy caused by the Syrian regime that is applying the most horrific violations against the resilient citizens of Homs.
In Hama suburbs, the regime forces renewed its bombardment on the town of Ashir and the cities of Kavarzita, Karnaz, and Latamina using mortar shells and helicopters, which led to destroying many houses in addition to killing and injuring many civilians. Meanwhile, the city of Hama witnessed massive explosions and heavy gunfire as the regime carried out several arbitrary arrests and after anti-government protests took place.
انتشار أمن والشبيحة بشكل كثيف 22/6/2012.
And in Deir ez-Zor, the heavy shelling by military aircraft continued on Muhassan city, while several citizens were killed and others were wounded after the renewed shelling of warplanes on the town of Al-Bu Kamal. An activist reported that the neighborhoods of Al-Amal and Jubaila witnessed fierce artillery shelling amid intensive gunfire, while many more people were wounded after the shelling on the villages of Tiana. Coming up in the bulletin, Leon Panetta accuses Iran of forming a militia to fight against the armed opposition. The foreign ministers of the Islamic countries who met in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia will suspend Syria's membership in the Islamic bloc, a decision that only Iran and Algeria opposed, saying that this will make matters worse in Syria. In addition to that, the King of Saudi Arabia, Abdullah bin Abdulaziz, suggested to form a meeting between the Islamic sects in Riyadh. Moreover, the summit also discussed the Palestinian case as well as the situation of Muslims suffering in Burma. The U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta accused Iran of forming a militia loyal to the Syrian government to face armed opposition. Meanwhile, the head of the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Martin Dempsey, claimed that the Iranian Revolutionary Guards have trained the militia composed of Syrian Shiites and some Alawites. The U.S. Secretary of Defense added that the United States is working with other countries in order to predict what the situation would be like in Syria after the fall of Bashar al-Assad.
But I think that it's a fair characterization to say that they could delay, but not destroy. What I'm telling you is based on what I know of their capabilities.
The Turkish newspaper quoted the U.S. ambassador in Ankara, who said that there are legal and practical obstacles in front of the establishment of a buffer zone or to impose a no-fly zone in Syria. The U.S. ambassador said in a news briefing that issues such as imposing a no-fly zone or a buffer zone in Syria are easily examined by difficult to implement, adding that these issues should be evaluated. He added that talks with Turkey do not mean that U.S. is offering a commitment to the establishment of such zones. The Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called on Western countries not to blow up the statement issued by the meeting of the International Task Force in Syria in Geneva. Lavrov said at a news conference in Minsk that Moscow is convinced not to undermine what has been achieved in Geneva and will try to get a clarification from the Western countries on the non-implementation of the agreement. He also said that the end of the Syrian crisis must be based on the unity of the Syrian territory and non-interference in the internal affairs of the country, calling to stop provoking the opposition to continue the armed struggle. Investigators for the UN Human Rights Forces said that the Syrian regime and its Shabiha committed war crimes and crimes against humanity, including murder and torture. Investigators added that some of the forces of the armed opposition also committed war crimes, but violations did not reach the seriousness, frequency, and scope of the violations committed by the government's army and security forces. The investigators' report, headed by Paulo Pinheiro, also said that the committee found reasons to believe that the regime forces and Shabiha have committed crimes against humanity, including murder, torture, war crimes, and serious violations of international human rights and international humanitarian law, including unlawful killing, torture, and arbitrary arrests, in addition to detention, sexual violence, attacks, and indiscriminate looting and destruction of property. And before we wrap up, here's another look at today's top stories. 193 citizens were killed in Syria today, mostly in Aleppo, after a massacre that took place in the city of Azaz. Heavy clashes occurred in the capital Damascus after an explosion that targeted the Chief of Staff Center. And a new report accused the Syrian regime of committing war crimes, and Lavrov calls the Western countries to oblige by Geneva's conference outcomes. With this, we end our news bulletin from Orient TV. For more updates about the Syrian revolution, please visit our Facebook page. Thank you for watching.